Hi, and welcome to Diversity in the Community. I am your host, Theresa Harris. I am so pleased to have with me today one of my fellow journey writers, Miss Regina S. Dyton, MSW Director of Community Health and Well-Being at Trinity Health of New England at St. Francis Hospital. We will also be hearing from some of the community advocates of Project Hope and some of the crime victims who will share their touching stories. I thank you all for being with me today. Regina, tell the audience a little about yourself. What is Project Hope and what is the goal of the group?
Certainly. Thank you, Theresa, for having us. We're so happy to be here. Project Hope is a program of the Family Advocacy Center at St. Francis. And it is dedicated to providing services to victims of crime. What's special about Project Hope is that it targets communities that are unfortunately statistically more likely to be victims of crime, while also statistically underserved and not responded to appropriately through the systems that exist, criminal justice systems, law enforcement, medical people, mental health providers, people who somehow are like off the radar for being helped. And our 5 target populations are Muslim women, people with disabilities, Jamaican and other Caribbean, West Indian women, transgender women of color, and immigrants and refugees. And our method of getting these services and help to people that they need is to utilize community advocates for each of the populations. And so to that end, we have those 5 people who outreach in their communities here with us today. Okay, and Nzima Hutchings is our community advocate who outreaches to Muslim women. Ravyn is here with us as the community advocate for transgender women of color. Constanza Segovia is the person who is working with immigrants and refugees. Ornella Thompson had to work right now. She is the official community advocate for Jamaican and other Caribbean West Indian women. But we have today with us Larissa Rhone, who has been a volunteer with everything we do for a long time and does a wonderful project of her own in which we collaborate, helping Jamaican victims of child and adult sexual violence. Aaron Pop Lewis is our person with community for people with disabilities. He's unable to be with us. Cathy Ludlum is with us, and we're so glad she is. And Cathy is a great advocate for a long time. I met Cathy a long time ago, and I was so glad I did. And so she's done such great and continues to do such great advocacy for people with disabilities all throughout Connecticut. And let's see. And so we're going to begin with having people talk about victimization and what their experience was like. And then we're going to follow that by looking at what are some of the barriers to people getting help when they're being victimized, reasons why they report or don't report, and then what are some of the things that we could do with looking at the strengths that exist in our communities. Let's start with Cathy, please, and welcome and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, Regina, and thank you, Theresa. It's a pleasure to be here about something so important. Well, you know already, I'm Cathy. I have a severe physical disability. I use a wheelchair. I don't have any use of my arms or legs. Nevertheless, I work and I play and I have a really good life in a lot of ways. And I'm fortunate to have lived in my own home for almost 28 years now. I do this by hiring people to come in and out and assist me with very basic activities such as bathing and dressing and eating and all the things that people take for granted unless you can't do them alone. I have people come in generally about 3 times a day. I work with about 6 or 8 people a week. And I also have a live-in assistant to provide support overnight. And I want to say that I've had many great assistants over the years. But I'm here today to talk about a situation that was not so good. And that was with a live-in assistant I had a few years back. I did not think of what happened as abuse per se, and I did not think of it as something that should or could have been reported. I'm learning new things as I go along, but all I knew at that time was that I was uncomfortable. It's important that you know that this person had many really wonderful qualities. She was smart, generous to a fault, funny, and I was very fond of her. She had a strong concern for my well-being, and she was willing to do anything to help me out. When my part-time people called out, she was right there to get me out of bed, help me eat whatever I needed. But when this started happening more often, and she was filling in a lot, I learned that she was a jealous and angry person. And she now saw these other hours as belonging to her. And she didn't really want anyone else working with me. She wanted to be my only provider. So she did not want me to hire new people, which I desperately needed to do. But anytime I started that process, she would throw a fit, or she would try to find things wrong with the new people so that I wouldn't hire them or wouldn't keep them. She watched what I did and she listened to my conversations, even if I was in a room with the door shut. And it was really kind of creepy. I was also physically hurt, not intentionally and usually not badly, although one time I was badly hurt. But it was about communication, and we were not able to communicate with each other effectively, and so bad things happened to me. Anytime I tried to talk with her about our issues, trying to make it better, I would get lectured about what a bad person I was. So over time, I just kept getting smaller and smaller in my own eyes. I kept constantly reliving our painful discussions, and I obsessed about what I could do to fix this situation. I wanted her out eventually, but she had nowhere to go, and I have a big heart. Besides, I was afraid that if I told anyone what was happening, someone would decide that I should not be living on my own anymore, and I would end up in the facility somewhere. And then I would lose the independence I still had left. So I really felt so trapped. And I lived like this for 2 years. Eventually, when things got bad enough, I did finally put her out. It took a couple of days. And at that time, I was really afraid for my safety. So I had friends and neighbors and other assistants be here 24/7 until she left. And when she did leave, the relief was just amazing and instantaneous. But it's not over yet. The healing process continues, and after being so trapped for so long, I'm still not fully free of the memories, the images, the things that happened during that period of time. But I am so thankful that at least the worst of it is over now. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Cathy. And now I'd like Larissa to speak for us, please.
Hi, again, my name is Larissa. I'm Larissa Rhone. And this forum, first of all, I want to say thank you to Regina and Theresa for having me be a part of this forum. I am a Black woman that happens to be living with a disability. I am Jamaican and also am a third-generation rape survivor. My victimization began when I was only 5 years old by my parents taking me one day actually, and they were on their way out of town and decided to have my grandmother babysit at 5 because they had to go to Kingston. And I'm from Jamaica, as I mentioned. So they left me in my grandmother's house for that one day with the intent to come back and get me that night. However, unforeseen issues happened and my dad had to stay over, which meant I had to stay over at my grandmother's house. My grandmother's husband took full advantage of that opportunity and he struck. I was first molested at 5 years old and I was threatened at that point not to say anything to my parents. Well, I didn't listen because the moment my mom returned, I informed my mom what had happened that night. She never sent me back to the house, at least not unattended. However, 5 years later, they migrated to the US. And because of that migration, my siblings and I'm the eldest of 6, was 5 at the time. My siblings and I were split up all over the place. Within the space of a few months, it ended up that I was taken from the home that I was sent to, and I started visiting my grandmother's home, and it started happening again. Because of issues again, I ended up living at my grandmother's house. And so at age 11, my parents left when I was 10, but at age 11, I ended up having to go back and forth to my grandmother's, which led to my living there. And he started raping me from age 11 through ages 16. Because of what happened at 5, when I first told my mom, and she basically asked me to be quiet about it, not to say anything, not to tell my dad about it, a 5-year-old child, I listened to my mom. And therefore, when it started happening, when he started raping me at 11, I decided not to talk about it. However, at age 13, I caught this man with my youngest sister. She was exactly 10 years my junior, sorry. And he was molesting her at 3 years old. That prompted me to speak again. Now, what happened as a result of that? My sister and I, my baby sister and I, were split up. We were removed from the home temporarily. I was sent to live with a grandaunt because everyone in the family, again, decided to keep it a secret, to keep it hush. No one informed my grandmother of what was happening. They took us from the home and they sent my sister to live with an aunt and sent me to stay with a grandaunt. I also happen to have, as I said, a disability. I have sickle cell anemia. And while I was staying with my grandmother, unfortunately, the stress of all of it triggered a sickle crisis. I got sick at around 2 a.m. one morning, and my grandaunt looked at me and told me that unfortunately she can't keep me. I can't stay with her. This was about a week into my stay, a week to 2 weeks, no longer than that. And she can't stay with me. I can't stay with her because she's afraid I'm going to die on her. So she ended up getting a car at 2 a.m., brought me to the hospital, and practically left me there. So I ended up at my grandmother's house again because they had to come and get me because she never wanted me staying with her. And that happened, as I said, from I was 11 until I was 16 years old. And as Cathy mentioned earlier, with the trauma of what happened and the process of going through everything, the healing process has been a very tedious one. And over the years, I have struggled with a lot of issues, mental issues included, until about 2013, I found out that this same abuser was also sexually assaulting my younger cousins. And it wasn't until my adult years also I found out that he had also raped my mom from she was 6 until she was 16. Not just my mom, but my aunts and a whole host of cousins, female cousins in that family. And so in 2013, when I found out he was still doing this, I developed what you could call a righteous anger, some indignation, and at that time decided that enough was enough and I was going to do something about it. And I flew to Jamaica and made a report and basically pressed charges against this man. The court case lasted a whopping 3.5 years. And I can say that we were successful, in a small victory. And by that, a small victory I consider because even though he pleaded, he was sentenced to a couple of years of he served a sentence at home. He was sent home to serve his sentence. And that to me was bittersweet because even though I'd gone through the process and yes, he ended up pleading and all of that, to know that he was sent home to serve a sentence because of all the craziness, the reasons and the rhymes as to why, his age, him being old and pretended to be sick and all of that. So yeah, he was sent home to serve his sentence. But as I said before, the healing process has been a long one. And that would be 1 or 2 examples of my victimization.
Thank you, Larissa.
You're most welcome.
Moved by the court saying he was so old, and the first thing I'm thinking, but all of these girls were so young.
Yes.
Like, where is that? Thank you for sharing that. Ravyn, would you talk to us next, please?
I am a trans woman of color, trans woman, victim advocate. And when I was a little kid, of course, me not knowing my true identity at that point in like kindergarten, I acted the way I acted. I enjoyed more feminine things like dressing up, doing hair, stuff like that. Anyways, at about like 1st or 2nd grade, my uncle would abuse me every chance he got. And I would tell my mom and she wouldn't do anything about it because she didn't think it was serious, although he was the same person who was frequently in and out of prison for abusing women, ironically. Around that same period of time, I had my first sexual experience with my babysitter's son. So when I was in like 3rd grade, my mom was embarrassed of me behaving the way I behaved and actually tried to drown me. And when I got to college, I experienced what I would consider a real rape. And then within the last couple of years, I met this guy who was actually an abusive boyfriend, and that ended on a decent term. The police actually arrested him, and he's been in jail ever since. So yeah, those are my top five personal stories.
Thank you. And that's an example of what, is called polyvictimization, of having been victimized in many different ways, and in this case, by many different people. And your individual story is unfortunately representative of the stories of many transgender women, but especially transgender women of color being victimized and murdered at just ridiculously disproportionate rates. So thank you for standing up for everybody, really, and sharing that. And now I'm going to go to Nzima, please.
Hello, everybody. So I am Nzima Hutchings, and I am an advocate for Muslim women. And so my story is about being a Muslim woman when I walk out my door and identifying as a Muslim woman and being subject to being targeted. I have to say that my situation had led me to write it out, to talk to a solicitor, a therapist that happened to be a therapist who doesn't charge me to talk about my fears. Um, a lot of my identity, when I walk out the door, I don't have to say who I am because I'm wearing a hijab. And so I want to talk about some things that happened recently in the last few years. And I can't say it all happened just on Trump's time, but walking out my door, identifying as a Muslim, looking like a Muslim woman, you have people who are bold in their words and their actions, who would walk up to you, walk up on you, follow you, and make bold statements as if they're going to hurt you. And my last encounter was last year in Barnes & Noble's and the Starbucks, when someone publicly humiliated me, stopped everybody in the cafe area to look at me. Basically, he asked me what the weather was, and I thought that was strange. And then he just bluntly asked me what my ethnicity was and where am I from, because I had that thing on my head. And then recognizing that I'm American, there's no foreign accent, and and looking stupid with other people looking at him. This man had to be about 40, between 40 and 50. The tension went on him. However, no one said anything, why are you questioning her? Why are you bothering her? I just came in to sit down. So with fears of someone hurting me and watching the news with so many Muslim women, hijab being snatched off of their head, no one was happy to see President Obama to win the election. I would have to say from then on, and when Trump got in, things got even bolder. So I have been in situations where I felt like I had to walk a little harder, to wear my clothing a little differently. I think I just went into, protection mode instead of my rights mode, and starting to wear my hair more so in a gaily, or sometimes just with my hair out. The last forum we had as Hope at St. Francis, the speaker Aisha walked up to me and she gave me salams and she said, "You are brave." What she was talking about, and then she pointed to my head. She was talking about my hijab. And so that may not be what someone would identify as being a victim, but it is emotionally taxing. My husband and I would argue because he would say, why don't you just don't wear it? He would encourage me not to wear it. And my youngest son, my name wasn't originally Nzima, my name was changed. But and a lot of converts changed their names. And my youngest son was interested in changing his name. And I convinced him not to, because it will identify him. Certain names identify people. So if he said his name was Ali or Muhammad or Kashif or, something like that, people will recognize him. So through fear of not receiving a job or being walked upon or humiliated, sometimes we go into just play it safe mode. But the last case that I read about happened in Oregon in November, where this woman pulled off this 23-year-old woman pulled off another 24-year-old woman hijab and rubbed it all over her body part sexually and attempted to choke her with it. And so there are some people who are just really bold in their on what they do. And so if you look at structural racism, biasness, prejudice, that would affect different places and leave you not to call for help because you somehow feel unpatriotic because you're wearing a hijab or you going against the dominant society, and it puts you in a place of just not advocating for yourself. And so it takes time to get to where I am, to just wear a hijab and lean on your faith and move the way you do. And you will realize that there are some really good people out there who would start to stick up for you. And so now we have this thing called, wear a hijab day, to encourage people to take their control back, to not live in fear. So that's one of my personal stories that I wanted to share.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody. I definitely heard some themes as I was listening to everyone. And one is, often when we're victimized or when we're threatened, we try to hide or make ourselves small or, minimize, just try, not to be noticed, look at those things. And it's horrible to not be yourself. That's something that no one should be asked to do, much less feel forced to do. I also heard that a lot of times people are wondering, was this actually a victimization? It made me feel bad. I felt afraid. I felt threatened. But sometimes we don't call for help or report something because we're not sure if it really qualifies as a crime. And the other is, and Nzima talked about nobody did anything, and Larissa talked about telling a mother who said, well, don't say anything, don't do anything about it. And so you're wondering, is there any help? The people you see, the people who are responsible for helping you, raising you, caring for you, taking care of you, aren't doing anything. It's really disempowering. But what I encourage people to do is not, and we'll get to more of this later, you don't have to be sure that it was against the law. It made you feel bad, it made you afraid, and you were threatened. That's enough to give the Family Advocacy Center a call and ask for someone from Project Hope to support you. Many times we'll find that people have been victims of actual crimes and just didn't know it was a crime. What Nzima talks about, I'm not a lawyer, certainly might qualify as a hate crime, or certainly very prejudiced harassment. What Cathy spoke about, I think would certainly qualify as abuse and neglect in terms of verbal abuse, emotional abuse, and being hurt badly at one point may well fall into neglect. So just to encourage people to speak up and know that we're there. The next piece we're going to go into briefly is to just look at what are some of the, I talked about some, but what are some of the reasons that people don't report or call out for help? And what are some of the strengths in that community that can be used to help keep people safer? So why don't we start with Cathy?
Thank you, Regina. In my community, I think one of the things that is one of the largest barriers we have when things like this come up is a lack of privacy. If you're like me and you need someone to help you, open the mail, make phone calls, do things in your house. I often say that there won't be anything I'm doing or thinking that my assistants won't know about because we work together that closely. So there is the whole privacy issue combined with the fear I mentioned earlier about ending up in a facility. A lot of us with severe disabilities who live on our own are kind of bucking the tide anyway. And we are concerned about authorities coming in and saying, you're not safe, we need to move you. And so that makes us not want to do anything about it in a lot of ways. So those are two of the barriers I see most often. And I think it's important also that people realize that disabled people are disproportionately often the victims of crime, sometimes twice as likely to be victimized as other people. In fact, in the last 5 years, over 650 disabled adults and children have been murdered by parents, other family members, or caregivers. There is a group that actually tracks murders of people by those they should be able to trust. And if anyone in the audience wants to know more about that, just Google Disability Day of Mourning. It happens every year on March 1st. And there's a lot online you can learn about that. And then in terms of strengths, in my community, we have a strong will to survive. We have to, because we've already been through a lot to get as far as we've gotten thus far. So I think that strength bodes well for us in these kind of situations as well, along with our resourcefulness. We have to be creative. We have to be good problem solvers, and we have to think outside the box. In my case, when I was actually ready to start talking about this, I did it by email because I could decide when and how to reach out. And the subject line of my email, all capital letters, was, please don't call me about this. I wanted to have all interactions just by email. And that's how we did that. So thank you.
And I like the fact that you strategized and came up with something to help yourself. And I think a lot of people can learn something from you. All right. Larissa.
So I believe there's several barriers for example, to survivors of sexual assault or just survivors of any kind of abuse reporting in my community. One of those things would be the conditioning, the culture on a whole, and the cultural attitudes towards certain things. For example, I know for a fact one of the reasons that it created a major barrier for me was my not feeling safe. Being Jamaican and growing up in that culture that you constantly heard this statement of informer for dead. This simply means anyone that opens their mouth, you fear retribution because you know that most likely you're going to be attacked. And which was the case for me even as an adult, when I decided to speak out and I started the whole court procedure, is that I was constantly being threatened. Traveling to Jamaica, I was constantly receiving calls from blocked numbers and threatening me to leave the island. And that was me being an adult doing this and not even living in the country anymore. But yet I was still afraid. Never stopped me because at that point it was do or die at that moment. But that's one of the reasons, and that's one of the major barriers that I think is causing this issue. And might I add that a lot of these attitudes, even though I now live in the US, but we're speaking on behalf of the Jamaican community and the population, so many of us migrate here and we still have that mentality. We're just afraid. Another thing is, another one of the condition that we grew up with, just being conditioned about, is not trusting the police. You're not trusting the police. You're not trusting the governmental agencies. And coming from Jamaica, and even now going back and doing work there, you realize how difficult it is to report, and the agencies, the governmental agencies that are there to help victims, they're not working cohesively. And so these matters are stretched out for however long, for years. I have a few girls now that attend the Journey to Free, Awaken retreat, and their cases have been in court, some of them for over 5 years. And these are very young girls. And so this would be another barrier. And as it relates to migrating and living here in the US, the same thing applies. We don't know certain information. We don't know the resources that's out there. And they're afraid to ask because people are just assuming it's the same thing. Another one of the barriers that I think is just the lack of empathy. And this again falls under, the cultural attitude where in Jamaica and this community, there's so many people that at this point, it's as if the abuse, any kind of, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual assault, people have become so conditioned in a sense that it's almost not a big deal anymore. This is the society that we live in, unfortunately, where also women and children are not valued. I'm a product, I grew up in a household with a father that would constantly tell me that I am worth nothing. He had no respect for women on a whole. And unfortunately, I grew up seeing that a lot of men around me, that's the thought process. That's the mindset. It's as if we're property. And so you just do whatever you darn well please. And that to me is a major barrier, because I don't know, how do you begin to combat this when so many feels as if it's not a big deal, or you have so many men that's running around just feeling like they're entitled to do whatever because there's not much value to their women. Another thing, which falls in the same thing, is just, as I said before, just the conditioning to not trust, not believe that this can change, and it's been happening so long and not much is being done, so it's not a big deal. Why bother reporting, because nothing is going to come out of it? And then, you have young girls that are asking, if I report, then what? What's going to happen to me? Because again, they're not knowledgeable of the resources. And even if the resources are there, the process in which you have to go through, it becomes a deterrent. So that's one of the attitudes. Now, as it relates to strengths, what I can say about Jamaicans and a lot of Caribbean people is that, one, I know without the shadow of a doubt, they're very hardworking people. They work hard. They're very ambitious. And another thing is they're rather independent and proud to a fault. Another thing that I think is a major strength is the level of resilience. They're resilient to the T, and this is one of the reasons, and it borders into the strength, is that despite everything that they've gone through and you put us through, there's just this fight, we stand up and you want to press through it. Another strength that I would mention, or I would touch on, is that we do have the ability, and we love working together. However, working together with the fact that we have support. If you're just doing this on your own willy-nilly, not knowing what to do, where to go, where to turn, people are a little bit more reserved and won't really push towards whatever. But once there is a cause and they know that they have support, or let me say we know that we have support, and people will jump on the bandwagon and do what it is, because at our core, Jamaicans and people from the Caribbean, just like, right across the board, they're loving at the core, and they want to see and want to do what's best for their family and their friends and their community. So if things are expressed to them a particular way, or they do know of these resources and that it's there and it's going to really help, and it's not going to be something that they have to go through a bunch of tapes and red tapes and all of that to get to, they will come together and they will work. So those are some of the strengths.
Great. Constanza, would you talk about what you think are some of the barriers for immigrants and refugees reporting crimes or getting help with them, as well as strengths in that community? And I just want to take a second to make it known that it's not required, if you're an adult, that you make a police report to get help from us. That you don't have to do that. And so we can, look at ways to help that may not involve making a report. And you can also change your mind if you want to do it later. We'll do it with you. Okay, with that, Constanza.
Thank you, Regina, and thanks for having this conversation. This is great to be here. I am Constanza Segovia. I'm a community advocate for the immigrant and refugee population in Greater Hartford. I am an immigrant myself, formerly undocumented, and I do a lot of organizing in my immigrant communities, specifically Latinx, undocumented immigrant community. I wanted to speak directly to the barriers. For the most part, a lot of the things that Larissa was actually talking about in terms of the experiences that we bring from other countries in terms of interactions with the police, and also with our faith in government doing anything if we go to report something, right? And and then coming here as an undocumented person, there's also the added sense that you don't know if interacting with police might lead to then getting ICE called on you, or really any interaction with government, or and I will even push it as far as putting your name down and giving your personal information to any institution. So there's like the fact that there's this big institution that you would be sharing your information with is a barrier. So that's why this program is huge for our community, because to be able to talk to somebody who understands where you're coming from, who understands all those concerns, and then being able to still access the resources that are available addresses those barriers directly. Another big barrier for the undocumented community, the Latino undocumented community, is language. A lot of the time, people are Spanish speaking, and sometimes Spanish is their second language. So a lot of times their first language is an indigenous language that is just, not something that we can easily get interpretation for. And when you add to that having to share traumatic experiences, and you have to talk to somebody in your second language, or even on the other side, even a lot of organizations will say that they have somebody who speaks Spanish, and they have someone who kind of speaks Spanish, who is from a Spanish speaking family, but they don't really speak Spanish. So a lot of times and again, that's different when you go order coffee somewhere, but when you're talking about a very personal experience that has impacted your whole life and you're already resistant to the idea of sharing it, that barrier can be huge. Can just stop people from engaging at all. A lot of times the barriers to access for the immigrant community are tied to the idea or the experience of migration. Because we feel like we are off another place, we don't know how systems work here. We don't know, what they'll ask. So sometimes it's just the lack of clarity and the lack of familiarity with systems in this country. And again, that's why it's really important to have a community advocate that can help navigate that and can give you the assurance that, no, you're not going to go through this whole process and then be turned away on the last step. But, also our migrant experience makes us who we are and makes us the strong people that we are. And, that is where a lot of our strength comes from, a lot of our resilience, a lot of the fact that we're very resourceful, and because there's no government safety net for the most part, we rely on each other for strength and support and for access to resources. And we have a lot of, community initiated resource networks that, and a lot of the time that works, but has its limits, right? So it ends up not addressing, so going back to the specific needs of victims of violence, that kind of ends up being left aside a lot of times in those community, like informal networks, because that's usually, around work and, like the day-to-day kind of like in and out of surviving in this country. And, it should include the work that the Greater Hartford Family Advocacy Center is doing, because this is survival, but it doesn't. Usually, people who experience violence in a way, that same way that like our community is so interconnected, ends up being a detriment, because you're less likely to report a family member or a partner, because you don't want to put them in danger and then have the whole family be in danger with the police or with ICE. It's just the fact that we, in the immigrant community, we're also tightly bound, actually makes, these situations very challenging, because it involves your whole livelihood. And I know that's true for a lot of other communities too, but I speak about what I know. And another thing I wanted to mention is that the work of the Family Advocacy Center is really important in also being like a hand to hold through the process of having to report something to the government, because of all the barriers that I mentioned. It's really nice to know, as a member of the immigrant community and an advocate for immigrant rights and for women's rights, and human rights in general, that we do have organizations that will help us access resources that can help us be safe, and not have to interact with police if we don't feel like we have to, but have, going back to what Regina was saying about how people can do an interview with professionals at the center and not necessarily have to do a police report to access some resources that are available, or even find out that filing a police report is not as inaccessible as it seemed when they were going to do it on their own.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Once again, I'm hearing the themes. I'm going to push us along a little bit and ask Ravyn to go next.
So the strengths for being a trans woman in general, and a trans woman of color specifically, are strength, the strength to be yourself no matter what you go through, courage to always be yourself, and resilience. After everything I've gone through, like, I don't know, I always knew that at some point I'd have my own space. And right now, I'm finally at a point where I'm starting to build on what I've always wanted. So, being optimistic, I guess. Barriers are not being respected or treated fairly within the communities, wherever you go, whatever you're trying to do, even places where you expect to improve your life. That's always a barrier. Feeling helpless and a lack of a sense of community. People who can understand what you go through and identify with you.
All right. And Nzima.
Okay, so I like to start with the barriers. And the barriers, I would say, would come from leadership, the leadership, the powers that be. I think leadership, with the lack of empathy, justice, and attention to hate crimes, further perpetuate or grow, fuel, whatever you want to choose, criminalization against one group of people. The other barrier would be, okay, so now I am a convert, I'm American Muslim, I'm African American. I sometimes, that is another dominant barrier, but I have to say, more so the barriers coming from hate crimes, leaderships, structural biasness and prejudice, and the feeling, oh, the the feeling that you are that you deserve what you get, but that you're on your own, and that not to trust government help or handout or support, because they may re-victimize you, they may re-traumatize you. They are the ones at the other end of beating you and abusing you. I say that with saying that the immigrants, Muslim, because there's a large population of Muslims that has a whole different plight of issues that they're going through. So everything that Constanza said, I would have to piggyback and say that is one of the same barriers. Not trusting, having to call 911 and not, now if you have an issue or you feel like your paper is not right, I think you just got Black people to fill out the census. I mean, we have a lot of things going on. But I think that's the major barrier with the foreign Muslims, everything that Constanza said, and with Muslims, period, just having people publicly almost give permission to victimize, to beat, abuse, and hurt people that is not part of the dominant society or the dominant religion. And I would have to say, for our strengths for Muslim women would be sisterhood and awareness of these different issues going on, and being able to talk about it and support each other with it, to encourage each other. And also, a lot of Muslim women are entrepreneurs. So when going for a job, they have skills. You'll find a lot of Muslim people, rather if you're looking at whatever sect you're looking at, you can be looking at the Nation of Islam Muslims, you can be looking at the Sunni Muslims or whatever, you would notice, wow, they have a strong hustle of entrepreneurship, and a lot of that is self-independence. So I think that would be a strength.
Thank you very, very, very much. Now, this is just a summary of the services that are available at the Greater Hartford Family Advocacy Center. And so I'm going to ask Nzima to stay on, because she's going to talk to us a little bit about a type of interview that's available for victims.
Okay. So the Greater Hartford Family Advocacy Center offered forensic interviews for children ages from 3 to 17. The Greater Hartford Family Advocacy Center coordinates and conducts neutral and fact-finding and developmentally sensitive interviews of children in response to suspicions of child sexual abuse and other forms of family violence. These video recorded interviews conducted by experienced professionals in collaboration with investigators are designed to elicit complete and accurate information while minimizing any additional trauma to children. And the forensic experiential trauma interviews is for adults, for age 18 and up. The FEDI is called the FEDI interviews, and the FEDI interviews are offered for any adult victims of crimes, particularly adult victims of sexual assault and or physical assault, domestic or community violence. FEDI interviews are also successful with people who may have witnessed violence, so that's the secondary person. Such interviews may be especially helpful for vulnerable populations, such as those with developmental disabilities or mental illnesses, who would be better served in a therapeutic environment. So with that being said, there are interviews that a person may receive when seeking help for the traumatic or violent crime or situation, and they may have an interview with the cops or something, and the tack is different from a FEDI interview. The traditional interview asks technical questions: who, what, when, why, how, what time, what does this look like, and is more role and real is less empathetic, is informational. It doesn't take into account of the whole person of the trauma response that person might be going through because of the situation that they just went through. The FEDI interview allows for a person to share where they are, to respond to answering questions by share what they remember by different senses. It's more sensory. So if the interviewer was asked to expand on what they're describing, opposed to being fed what questions or being hammered on specifics like time, they would go into it would go more into feelings, like I felt this way, I heard this. It's more responsive to a person who would just receive a traumatic situation and understand being trauma informed.
Great job. And then Ravyn's going to talk about advocacy.
So, at the center, we offer support in making a report to authorities. We can accompany you to court hearings. We offer court education. We provide updates on cases when available. We help with victim compensation through the Office of Victim Services, and we provide referrals and resources in the community, like public assistance and other basic needs.
All right, Constanza is going to talk to us about outreach and Under Our Wings.
Yes. So Under Our Wings is a volunteer program where community members connect with each other and with the community, learn about what the center has to offer, and share that in the community so that not only people become aware of what the center offers, but also are more ready to open up and have the ability to report what has happened to them. And anybody can join, so that's something that's available for anybody who wants to be part of this work. And in terms of greater, wider community outreach, in general, the Greater Hartford Family Advocacy Center hosts culturally responsive events, conversations, forums for specific communities so that outreach can reach those who have been historically disenfranchised and left out of these type of efforts. Usually nonprofits, a lot of nonprofits will give up on our communities, but this organization has actually created a way for us to reach out directly, and do that extra work so that people have a chance to feel safe and thrive in their lives, and take into account the specific ways that our lives are complex and intersectional and layered.
Thank you so very, very, very much. And Marilia is going to wind this part up by talking about our mental health services.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to also tell you that we offer trauma-informed mental health therapeutic services to support the victims of crime, as well as to support their families. Our mental health clinicians will start off by doing an initial comprehensive assessment. And then what they do is they create an individualized treatment plan, which is also co-created and shared with the client and their families if applicable. So the therapeutic services by our mental health clinicians are evidence-based, and they are modified for cultural needs. They also offer two great programs. One is a psychoeducational program that focuses on teaching personal body safety for children, usually young children. And another program that's a therapeutic program for older children who present with problem sexual behavior. All of these services, these mental health services in particular, as well as all services, are provided free to the victims of crime and their families. There's no insurance taken, no insurance needed. So that shouldn't be a concern for anyone as far as payment is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just do a short thing, but we are working now to put together some online forums that are going to be more in depth for Muslim women, for and about Muslim women, as well as transgender women of color, and then another one for refugees and immigrants that will include Jamaican and other Caribbean, West Indian women. So we don't have dates for those yet, but I'm asking people to stay tuned. We will be working with public access television, a number of community radio stations, and virtually to announce these upcoming events. And so I just wanted everybody to know there's more to come. And I'll turn it back to Theresa.
Oh my goodness. I just would love to thank each and every one of you. I was very touched. I thank you guys so much for telling your stories. And I'm sure this program is going to touch a lot of people. And we're going to put the number up at the end when we edit this so that people be able to get in touch with you with any questions, anything. I would love to thank Regina, Nzima, Constanza, Ravyn, Larissa, Cathy, and Marilia. Thank you guys so much for taking the time out to come on the program today. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for all the work that you do to help others. So many times in this world, people are just selfish, but I thank you guys for reaching out, helping each other, and just coming on it just to tell your stories. It just means so much. So I thank you again for being with me on diversity in the community, and all of you guys out there watching. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.